Good afternoon, welcome. Is this still, can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. Thank you all for coming today. We're very excited to be presenting a lecture with Cuauhtémoc Medina here at NYU Shanghai. I'm Alice Wang, visiting assistant professor here in the visual art area. Before we begin, I just want to thank the NYU Shanghai Arts and Sciences Events Committee and the NYU Shanghai Art Gallery for co-sponsoring this event with the visual art area. I'd also like to thank the university communications team, wherever you are, and the art gallery staff for their tremendous help in making this event possible. Lastly, I want to thank Michelle Hyun, the director curator of the NYU Shanghai Art Gallery, for agreeing to organize this lecture with me. And of course, thanks to Cuauhtémoc for accepting our invitation. So this lecture today is a co-organized between the visual art area and the NYU Shanghai Art Gallery. And actually today is a lecture that's part of a program called Foundations and Topics series within Room 100, the Spring 2019 project with the NYU Shanghai Art Gallery. So Room 100 provides a space and time to collectively consider fundamental questions of art and education and its institutions. More specifically tonight, Cuauhtémoc has agreed to respond to the question, why do we need a university art museum? With a lecture entitled MUAC, Museum as Intersection. So for those of you at NYU Shanghai, please remember to join us for the next event at the gallery, which is on Thursday at 12:30. There's going to be a facilitated study session in room 100 of a new temporary collection object. It's a sculpture by Guan Xiao, and it's on loan from the artist and antenna space. And also, another event, the next Foundations and Topics event is scheduled later this month on Tuesday, March the 26th from 5 to 7. And it will be a presentation by the local curator, Chen Yun, followed by a conversation with Julie Chen on the topic of what can art do, examining art practices beyond the institution and in the public realm. Also, copies of the Room 100 guide and full event schedule will be available just outside the auditorium as you leave. And also after the lecture, Cuauhtémoc will be in conversation with Michelle. Then we will open it up for a very brief Q&A. And then after the event, we'll have a little reception just up these stairs on the second floor lounge, which you should join us with some refreshments on the third floor. Okay. Let me just make sure I have everything. Sorry. Okay. So, in the context of Shanghai, where an incredible number of art museums have sprung up over the last 5 to 10 years, with even more to come, many of which are privately funded, the idea of an art space dedicated to the production of knowledge and research, as well as education within an interdisciplinary context of a university, is a rather exciting prospect. I'm excited to hear about Cuauhtémoc's experience working in Mexico City at the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporánea, also known as MUAC, at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So, Cuauhtémoc Medina is an art critic, curator, and historian based in Mexico City, where he has been the chief curator of MUAC since 2013. He is also the chief curator of the 12th Shanghai Biennale and has curated special projects such as the Mexican Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2009, also the Manifesto Biennial in Genk, Belgium in 2012. Between 2002 and 2008, he was the first associate curator of Latin American art collections at the Tate Modern in London. Since 1993, he has been a full-time researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas and a lecturer in philosophy and art history at UNAM. Please join me in welcoming Cuauhtémoc.
Hello. Thank you, Alice. It is really, really great to be talking here. And I also want to thank Michelle Hyun for the kind invitation to talk, which is something I really would like to comment on, because as you know already, I was in charge of the recent Shanghai Biennial. So it is really something special to be able to actually talk here about what I'm doing on an ordinary basis in Mexico. So, and I also feel that some of the issues that I might comment today could be interesting to be discussed in the overall issue that Michelle put on the table. What is the business of universities trying to have contemporary art institutions? So I guess that this is for me, and so it is. I hope I'm not going to bore you. So the first part goes without images, and it's called Continent Agent. We may not be wrong in sensing a certain fetishism in the widely extended assumption that the power and presence of a museum institution corresponds to the size, value, and connotations of the buildings it occupies. Despite they are not only designed to appear as the offspring of churches and Greek temples, museum buildings are much more significant than being only the vanity signature mirror objects of contemporary architects. We shouldn't be surprised by the excitement that building them frequently produces, which clearly outweighs the later commitment on their maintenance or the concern on their goals and functioning as cultural institutions. To a certain extent, museum buildings have an animist quality. They perform a number of roles in the public sphere that involves their quality as performers and actors in the social fabric. On the one hand, they appear to convey the values, messages, and social hierarchies related to the different classes and groups in our society. They conform and form their audience. But they also lend themselves to capture private feelings, memories, and aspirations. They are frequently talismans, objects of affection and fear, shelters of ghosts, memorials of nations and peoples. They become representatives and agents of their patrons and the political systems they represent. They also clearly embody the social aspirations that coalesce in the moment of their inception. Few objects call for more emotional response once they appear in the horizon of today's cities, even if in reality their physical size is smaller than most shopping malls. Above all, they seem to have become a necessary piece of furniture in our shared assumption on what are the facilities that comprise contemporary urban living. It is not the question so much that we can choose of their existence. The question is, what do we do with their inbred necessity? Well beyond the role which they have in urban speculation and social cleaning, the way they impose patterns of gentrification and symbolize the transition into a third sector economy in contemporary capitalism, contemporary art museums seem to have become the cathedrals of a certain symbolic value, that of our cultural anxiety. They involve the reflection, sometimes the personal reinvention of something close to spirituality in our very material world. In that light, it is very interesting to comment on one of the most characteristic issues of their power, and it is the relative snobbery with which museum professionals, curators, and to a great extent artists tend to keep the museum reification at bay by trying to be immune to the seduction of museum architecture. We are one of the few professional species who are bonded in despising the very same buildings that represent us towards the rest of the society. I am advancing the claim that our dutiful love at contemporary art and the institutions it accompanies is frequently matched by the horror and loathing for their architectonic being. The very same passion that visitors have for the rhetorics and ostentation of those buildings appear to us as an unacceptable distraction. It is as if we would suffer an audience that is content to judge, criticize, and celebrate the appearances of the frames and the quality of the video monitors in the gallery. For instead of the worship of the particular involved in the aesthetics of site specificity or the loving process of art as research, the existing sites and buildings where artists tend to focus their power of intervention, approaching the residue and aura of a pre-existing place, most contemporary art museums appear to us as enormous citadels of amnesia, excessively lighted and sterile white prisons, where it would appear that trying to save a figment of utopia or the smell of criticality is practically impossible in relation to the commercialized tastes of their patrons. At the same time, all these buildings appear as a monumental notwithstanding for our concerns. Our elitist loathing of the museum as a building fetish is a denial of the importance that they have in the constant negotiation of social power and resources that our tasks finally rely on. Well against the prejudice of the professionals against museum architecture, the building is clearly the foremost object of museum going. It's the first object to be contemplated and consumed. The means and message of an institution, the product of a certain capital accumulation that produces the civic object and the symbolic power that grounds the possibility of contemporary art culture in the public arena. As a matter of fact, being a museum professional means that in a day-to-day basis, the building of the museum is indeed the museum itself. And beyond that, it is the social presentation of a historical contract that establishes the sphere of our activities. In close inspection, museum buildings are the inscription of a number of commitments and mandates. They operate as witnesses and custodians of specific social contracts. If we frequently face those walls, windows, and corridors as enemies, it's because they represent the social forces that brought them about. It's an architecture that predestines artistic practice in terms of a certain number of material values, but also because they express a demand on what culture should represent for a number of people and classes. Those material constrictions and visual machines are agents of the powers that produce and sustain the space of art. Their solidity is a specific form of political writing, the inscription of a certain governance of sensibility, and a command to artists and audiences alike. I am trying to convey the importance that even the worst conceived and futile building of culture has. They are, in reality, the social fabric that we work with in itself. A building, above all, is a transactional object. Maybe our dissatisfaction with its powers lies in the importance that they have as means of the culture about and against which artistic and cultural critique stand. There's a dialectic which actually focuses on the building as the means to symbolize the battles that implicitly allow the museum to be part of something called contemporary culture or something alive. The fact that you need to always find this architectonic gesture as your companion, but also as the limit. I thought it could be useful to start this talk by discussing this uncomfortable aspect of museum culture. That a confession that I hope will make more sense from the vantage point of the real estate craze of a city like Shanghai, where effectively the architectonic accumulation is also the space where the negotiation of cultural institutions need to operate. But beyond that, I want to try to make a point about how is it that starting to discuss the institution I work with has to do with discussing the role of the building and the building of the building. MUAC, the University Contemporary Art Museum of the National University in Mexico, is a very recent concoct. It was built in 2008 out of the design of late architect Teodoro González de León, 1926-2016. You can see him here actually playing with the model of the museum. It's a photograph that I feel says a lot what is the relationship of museum design. Anyway, one of the most respected architects in Mexico, who developed a hybrid modern and historicist style that identifies many official public and corporative buildings with a somehow softer form of modernity that the Mexican elites actually identify with. My claim will be that even in the aspirational modernism aspect of MUAC, this museum building is the testimony, is the marker of a specific political shift. The commitment of the National Autonomous University of Mexico to become a key player in the contemporary art of that nation. But to demonstrate this, I need to make a certain historical detour. In 1952, UNAM, which effectively descends from the first university foundation in the Americas, in the New World, 4 centuries before, was subjected to a major real estate official operation. The post-revolutionary Mexican government decided to build a new university city in the volcano rock desert in the southwest of Mexico City, known as the Pedregal of San Ángel. This huge complex of buildings that was originally around 12 million square meters was built swiftly in less than 3 years by close to 10,000 workers. I know that these figures mean nothing in China, but they used to be impressive. I just realized how ridiculous all this here, but anyway, 50 years ago, it was a different story. This university city is with the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, the most important modernist landmark of the so-called developmentalist regimes of Latin America in the 20th century. And of course, these photographs, all of them that we're taking at the moment, are part of the rhetorics of that effort of precisely showing a moment when a great design appears in the space of nowhere. I just want to remark you that it is interesting that these photographs are objects of art in their own merit. So among the dozens of buildings, auditoriums, offices, sport facilities, libraries, and laboratories, one of its facilities was an exhibition space, a University Museum of Arts and Sciences, MUCA, an elegant industrial hangar built next to the architecture school that used to offer students and scholars a mixed program of art, design, archaeology, history, and sciences, and that had a major role in the developing of a public platform for modern and contemporary art in the 1960s and 70s, including dissident political proposals against the government and the dissident modernist projects of young artists dissident from the official Mexican art. Now, however, even from the way it was located, this is the major green in the center of the university. This is the main Olympic Stadium. This is the Vice Chancellery. This is the Faculty of Philosophy. This is the Architecture Faculty. And this is the place of the museum. And we could discuss this. It's a very interesting issue to discuss how the map of the Mexican university is actually a diagram of arts and sciences. There's a very old-fashioned kind of positivist organization of the way from philosophy to practice that is encompassed in the way the buildings were allocated. Anyway, so above all, the museum was understood as a service facility for the university population. It was not by chance that it was located close to the filters of communication that linked the university city with the city center, the bus station, the shops, the post, the bank offices. It appeared then as one of the membranes that would bring culture and art into the university's everyday life. As you can see, that building was a small part of a major historical renegotiation that inscribed the university professional classes and their discourses as part of the fabric of a modern project of Mexico, under the assumption that the development of the post-war era included elements of sophistication, such as an advanced exhibition institution. That balance of forces, of course, was to change dramatically over time. 50 years later, in 2004, a new contract came to overcome the significance of this early structure. When the National University upgraded, this is the interior of that museum, its facilities, budgets, and ambition, so as to become a central agent in the contemporary art scene. So there were very specific circumstances surrounding that leap. In December 2000, the presidential elections put an end to the 70-year rule of the single-party post-revolutionary system in Mexico, with the defeat of the Revolutionary Institutional Party, that's the name of our traditional power machine, revolutionary institutional party, and the ascent of a right-wing government led by President Vicente Fox. One of the bitter outcomes of that so-called democratic transition was the way cultural policy became of a secondary interest for the new administration. That furthered the neoliberal policies coming from the 1990s, but also, since it felt it was validated by popular vote, didn't care anymore as much for the legitimacy provided by the cultural apparatus that used to be very central in the previous design of Mexican power. In that context, the National University Vice Chancellor, a physician and psychiatrist, well, that's a cartoon about the change of the government in that moment. In that context, the Vice Chancellor, a physician and psychiatrist, Ramón de la Fuente, this guy on the right, made a personal decision, almost a Napoleonic decision, without consulting anybody, to occupy the space left by the federal cultural institutions in a matter of a handful of years, using the university resources that are granted by the chambers of deputies and his prestige as a fundraiser. He increased the number of cultural institutions in the university dramatically and swiftly. The novelty was that the new institutions were characteristically geared towards contemporary art, a sector that had grown in international prestige during the 1990s without being accompanied by a similar institutional development locally. Under the directives of Dr. Gerardo Estrada, who had been part of the student movement in 1960, and that had been the former director of the Fine Arts Institute, the university reclaimed the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the so-called Three Cultural Square in Tlatelolco, in the north of the city, to make a significant cultural center, the first one that really covers the north of the megalopolis, that includes the first memorial to the '68 movement. I want to point you out that this tower is the former Foreign Affairs building with an intervention by artist Thomas Glassford that suddenly became this kind of incredibly beautiful beam of culture in a zone that was very, very deprived of cultural interest. Besides, somehow following the example of the reconstruction of the Mies van der Rohe pavilion in Barcelona in 1992, the university reconstructed the Eco Museum that Matthias Geritz made in 1952 and had been totally destroyed, so as to create a new facility for art experimentation. And it also revamped the Chopo Museum that was until then a pretty dilapidated alternative cultural center, so as to turn it into a properly and well-funded, ambitious museum. Such institutional projects shouldn't be read only in terms of giving access to a wider audience, but as part of a political turn. They signaled a symbolic alliance with the contemporary art circuits that had not been taken into full account by the national policies since the independence alone of 1968 and 1971 had signaled a certain divorce between the Mexican state institutions and the new practices of experimental artists. There was indeed a gap that was particularly visible in the lack of collections after '68 that suddenly had to be accommodated and dealt with. In any case, the center of this operation was the decision to build a new museum they hired the former director of the National Museum of Art, Graciela La Torre, and Mexican-French curator Olivier Debrois, so as to both start a collection and make a building. And that was precisely the whole logic behind the opening of MUAC in 2008 with staggering attendance of more than 10,000 people. So we could discuss later on, if you want, a little bit more about this shift. But in reality, it was the moment when suddenly contemporary art became part of the normal cultural diet of the megalopolis. It normalized the access of contemporary art in a major scale to a general audience. A decade later, after staging more than 100 exhibitions and projects, and seeing its audiences grow steadily from 250,000 the first year to more than 500,000 visitors per year, MUAC is still a symbol of a number of negotiations. On the one hand, as in many other parts of the world, the museum is the bearer of the transition that contemporary art made from being allocated in marginal institutions that were basically catering to a versed contemporary art audience to becoming part of a new public goal, that of, let me call it this way, building a metropolitan museum of contemporary art. That, as I told you, normalizes the relationship between audiences and the current practice, bridging the former distrust between practitioners and audiences, and also the gap between the contemporary and the general taste. In a similar way, the nation state had to establish its mirror images in a number of cultural institutions in the 19th century, the university and the national museums above all. Contemporary capitalist centers seem to be required to produce something of a symbolic decor that includes the Contemporary Art Museum at its core. Then, the emergence of new contemporary art museums and the buildings that involve these negotiations in the sphere of capital investment preside the transit of contemporary art from the margin to the center of social representation, both as a prestige commodity and in terms of the way it facilitates the interaction of a plutocratic class produced by neoliberalism, as well as the enjoyment of audiences that, through consumption, debate, and mobilization, start living in a global cultural dialogue pertaining to the integrated world of the present. In that regard, however, there is a very important contingency. The specific circumstances in which a new geography establishes these facilities are key in the development of those new social institutions. Who, when, and how those institutions are produced defines in great part the character of the transactions that a specific location establishes in the future in relation to this field. There's probably no choice, but at least there is an issue defined by chance and history. So, it's not the same to have a rich person establishing with his collection the Metropolitan Contemporary Art Center, and having a nation state defining the space of contemporary art as one of the mandates of national culture, or, as it is in this case, having an academic center putting the table for the rest. The National Autonomous University of Mexico is not only the largest university in the Western Hemisphere, with more than 300,000 students and 30,000 staff. It remains the referent locally of the right to free education as key to the design of the nation state. And in that regard, is also historically the site of a number of important rebellions coming precisely from the student class as part of the middle classes, and the referent of cultural difference and cultural dissidence in the country. So this is an institution that is prided of its logic of being the period of enlightenment, of being non-religious, of trying to be advanced in relation to the rest of the country. Notwithstanding the importance of other university museums in having developed the fabric of contemporary art institutions around the world, let's mention only places like the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles or Museo de Arte Contemporánea of the Sao Paulo University, MUAC has this added meaning that involves the takeoff of the university into trying to be part of the new structures of capitalist culture. Then it poses questions of what kind of social texture can be activated from a place like this, that includes the academia and the social anxiety to which students are natural seismographs amongst its elements of orientation. 2, the museum as intersection. So the question is there any specific condition beyond being administered by the university that defines contemporary art institutions that depart from university organization? Is it their character reducible to offering just another incarnation of the notion of the public museum as institution, or are there specific possibilities in their development? I think that these lines of questioning are not rhetorical at all. They assume a real dilemma, a place of questions that needs to be defined in practice. To be sure, there are a number of components in the operation of a museum like MUAC that would be very difficult to imagine unless they relate to their location in the university. First, there is the strategic advantage represented by the intellectual resources, the university collections, and the networks of collaboration that the museum can have with teaching and research facilities located in their surroundings. We have at our disposal the largest film collection in Mexico at the UNAM Film Archive, but also the biggest concentration of library resources in Latin America. From the standpoint of the university museum, it's natural to make use of the participation of scientists, humanities scholars, and technicians to develop projects that would be difficult in other cases, that could include the use of robotics technology, or even the possibility of loaning rare species specimens like ajolotes, or the possibility here you see in a show by Maria Teresa Alves, this fish tank has one of these, specimen that is very close to extinction as one of the, you cannot buy them, it's illegal to fish them, so, it was easy to get it in there. But, okay, so but being beyond that, given the importance that the high school system has in a national university, that includes more than 100,000 youngsters that are mostly located in the periphery of Mexico City and tend to have low-income families, we are somehow forced to try to define a way to interact with a specific community. So we have developed this program called MUAC at Your Home, where we work with groups of high school students to lend them artworks or put them in collaboration with artists so as to make them stage their own exhibitions in a location of their choice. It could be a bakery or a flat in their neighborhood, granting not only a participation in the bourgeois privilege of dealing with art, but also a training in a number of museological practices. On a completely different level, we are fully articulated into a number of research and teaching functions. The museum is a venue for a variety of seminars on theory and contemporary art through a program called Expanded Campus that enables independent students to study together with those that are enrolled in graduate programs. It creates a kind of mixed structure where artists or writers can actually get to the seminars in the university, and it also makes it possible for art history students to at least smell the kind of ideas that come from the real art world. Besides that, it creates somehow some sort of grassroots community that is very, very, very demanding and is always putting pressure on the museum to be politically engaged and socially oriented. Of course, we are also founding partners of the master program in curatorial studies of the graduate art history program, which has a particularly high rate of professional hiring, but of course it also relates to the possibility of creating certain critical standards for the functioning of contemporary art museums in the region, not only in the country, but in South America as well. But it is also relatively logic for us to devote certain exhibitions, particularly those related to the research of contemporary art in the country, to come out from groups that include scholars with curators, engaged with students in long-term research processes. Here I'm showing you images of an exhibition that just closed on the Independence Salon. And these are exhibition projects that somehow are developing in seminar classrooms for a number of years and are precisely also helping the training of select postgrad students. But above all, I think that the other element that is characteristic is the fact that the museum has to be ruled with a certain political logic. As you know, universities need to be to take decisions in councils and committees, and that political logic of having to include academics, artists, and other curators in the decisions of the museum is something that comes natural in a place like the university, where the question of how you take decisions is not something that is taken for granted. Anyway, there's also a logic that understands that differently from other institutions, we need to be exhibitions with complex and demanding contents, but beyond that, given the fact that the university is a understands cultural dissemination as one of its constitutional goals, we are also a museum who understands the role of bringing audiences into the system as one of our intentions. So, finally, in the context of Mexico, there is a certain expectation for critical radicality in the cultural management of the university. A tradition that comes from the role of the university in the 60s and 70s, and especially from the way in which the University Museum served as the site of the avant-garde locally. So, and I'm showing you, for instance, an exhibition which was the first exhibition about issues of race that we made a couple of years ago. So in a country that, quite frankly, is undergoing a process of institutional decline, universities are also among the few institutions that still preserve a certain weak moral aura. So this is also a condition that allows us to understand our activity as necessarily hospitable to dissent and to be the site of a certain heterogeneity. So all those elements coalesce into a specific condition. More than any other museum, a university museum is able to become the representation of a broader diagram of forces. MUAC, like any other museum, represents the confluence of a number of specific social energies. But being in a university makes this condition explicit and allows ourselves to understand us as an intersection of diverse positions and tendencies. Having arisen with the establishment of modern political societies, museums are spaces where a variety of social agents and forms of constructing legitimacy converge, transform, and come into conflict. In that sense, we shouldn't think of the museum as an organ of some sort of unified sovereignty or as an expression of its workers or functionaries, so as to see it more as a diagram of the diversity of social forces and a synecdoche of the Republic. Let me just, in a certain way, go beyond the fact that the museum is therefore always the result of a certain collaboration. I'm just showing you somehow the extent of the kind of exhibitions that we make. We have a very mixed program of around 12 significant exhibitions per year that include very, very significant exhibitions of major artists. You're seeing the last retrospective of Harun Farocki, along with specific exhibitions looking into historical research of art in the continent. This is the exhibition of the relationship between design and artistic production of Vicente Rojo, along with trying to precisely give space to forms of practice like hitos taller that relate to an investigation of the world that connects with questions that university scholars and students might demand. We somehow use the advantage of having a particularly demanding audience. I mean, we can rely on the idea that the university allows us to have a starting point of an audience that has an active position to the understanding of art as part of culture and politics. And let me tell you that one of the characteristics of the museum is that 65% of our audiences are in between 16 and 30 years old. So we are incredibly lucky to run an institution that is not, as it happens in many institutions in the West, completely trapped into catering to old audiences, which is an element that sometimes explains the kind of decisions that specific museums have, and it's normally secret or not not entirely clear in the public. So there are things like showing the work of Jeremy Deller that make more sense there. And I just want to show you this because it's interesting. We have a number of exhibitions a year that are document-based. So they are about research, but also about archives. And we showed the Parasite project Great Crescent that researched performance radical activities in South Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong and Taiwan in the 60s. That it was something that, of course, would never have a space in a normal contemporary art museum. Or these are images from the exhibition of a very important Mexican feminist artist. I just want to jump to this. Okay, so upon joining the MUAC as head curator in 2013, I found it useful to explain some of these ideas with the aid of a Venn diagram that in reality I borrowed from simply stealing a representation of the behavior of primary and secondary colors. It was, I think, a diagram of Telefunken that I stole. So in that representation, as you can see, the museum is thought as activating and somehow spinning the overlapping confrontation and unfolding of at least three main forces: the academy, contemporary art production, and the heterogeneity of social anxieties and concerns that were pulsating in the public, in the audience. Upon being superimposed, these three fields produce a number of resulting fields. The need of a revisioning of our history, the creation of forms of sensibility that are transformed by the contact of critical art, and finally, the notion that the museum could be also, and again here, the space that would restitute the somehow lost field of the public intellectual, so as to offer both the academia and the cultural world a space where theory could be actually presented in public, which is something that I feel entirely different and very characteristic of what is contemporary art culture than the existence of theory in the university. This was an idea that I found particularly relevant, but also the way in which the clash between contemporary art and the anxieties of the audience could actually develop into a form of subjectivity that for a while I played on thinking as using an old notion by John Marx, that the idea of the development of theoretical senses. And you can see here somehow a development of those ideas. So in this, as I'm telling you, I mean, it was a need to think what it meant to work in this place. The museum appears as an energized nuclei of those interactions where wisdom, poetics, and sensation steer flows of desire, while at the same time in disputing and participating in the disputes of the hegemonic order. With a bit of imagination, it was possible to actually impose those concepts with the specific initiatives, the specific programs of the museum. You can see here, for instance, that the space of theory in public is our academic shared program of expanded campus. that you can see some of the lines of the activation of the relationship between audiences and contemporary art, and some of the orientations that we wanted to give the museum in terms of the divide between, let's say, the representation of contemporary art and the process of historical research. Anyway, aside from the illusion of a system that these diagrams could provide, they clarified, in my view, the mediating nature of the university museum, since they seem to always draw energy from the interspace of these different levels in terms of the ability of being the space of converging. The programming of MOAC exhibitions, for instance, responds to that heteroclite style. We serve different publics, confront them with experiences of culture that combine what is close and what is unfamiliar, and propose a constant interaction with uneven cultural practices. So the museum is understood in that sense as a place of diversity. We assume that rather than trying to gear the exhibitions towards satisfying general curiosity, we also need to be catering to very specific demands of intellectual and even esoteric interest, so as to nourish the expectations of complexity of a university audience. We would need to show side to side big references of recent global art with other practices that were more undecided and even politically kind. This is something that I'm just trying to show you. For instance, at the same time that we had a big Kapoor exhibition, across the door we had a first retrospective of Andrea Fraser's work. And it was deliberate that we wanted to have that at the same time with a feminist local artist, in terms of somehow making it possible for audiences to actually arrive to the museum to find exactly something that clashes with their original expectations. So instead of aiming at an average audience, whatever that ideological construct means, we serve a conglomerate of differences. Ideally, upon making his or her way through MOAC, an individual will be able to find something that fascinates him or her and troubles him or her. And that will be different from the reaction of the next person. We assume, in fact, that people should be able to love something they see and then find something they probably despise. That is somehow the goal of a museum, not to have a presumption of consensus. The special thing about the University Museum in that sense is to make patent the complexity of cultural experience that makes our diversity reflexive. This contribution is not only important in terms of infusing art with moments of reflection and politicization, but also in terms of forming complex attitudes amongst the members of the public that should resist the views that all the time threaten the emergence of intolerance and easy identity formation. At a time when, at least in Mexico, ignorance, moralism, and stupidity are frequently combined atrociously, I think that that's not just a local condition. We feel that wagering on this complexity is a form of social activism which is central to the role of the university and a museum inside it. So let me just finish with a final reflection about networks and articulations. A few weeks ago, I was walking to see the exhibitions in the museum. When I start to meditate in front of the so-called label of a new exhibition called No Me Cansaré, I Will Not Get Tired, about the tension between artistic and political practices in Mexico City in the recent decade. I was really fascinated. I was already thinking that I was going to be talking with you on the way my colleagues, curators Helena Chavez, Solinaro, and Alejandra Labastida had decided to represent the constant interaction, collaboration, and complicity of different projects and works that they had compiled in terms of illustrating the networks that had been operative in that era through a physical installation of wires connecting different groupings and initiatives in something of a kind of sculpture of a galaxy of actions and agents, a molecule of political imagination and aesthetic action. That 3D diagram immediately reminded me of a previous exhibit, precisely Jeremy Deller's History of the World from 1998, where he drew the connections between popular music, mass politics, and French culture in Britain in the late 20th century that were the underpinnings of his project of acid brass, namely the action of making a traditional brass band playing acid house music. I'm extremely fond of the way Deller suggested in that drawing that we reproduced in a mural form in the exhibition traveling Madrid, Mexico, Buenos Aires, and Bilbao, the pregnancy of social cultural forms. Beyond any notion of causation or affinity, or even less commitment, he argues in that diagram for the understanding of culture and politics as a free-floating number of intersections that create horizontal waves of sensibility and living beyond the normal assumptions of classification, and therefore also below the radar of power and repression. I felt that these diagrams that constantly cross over the lines that supposedly divide different styles, class definitions, and ideological identities are in clear line with the way the spaces of mass protest, social enjoyment, reflection, and politics are constantly overlapping in the contemporary art practice. How is it that we are, in fact, in an era where heterogeneized energies coalesce in a space of clashes and synergy? Despite it is less convoluted, it's clear to me that the diagram of intersections that I drew 5 years ago about how I understood MOAC is part of this understanding of culture as a network of fields, where our task is precisely to develop the way we connect these different forms by means of an incoherent articulation, if you may allow me to say it, rather than any certainty of identity or calling. Just recently, I had also experienced some of those possibilities by accompanying the forensic architecture team in their association with two human rights organizations, the Argentinian Group of Forensic Anthropologists and the Padre Pro Human Rights Center in Mexico City, to create the Ayotzinapa online platform, which helped activists and families of the missing 43 students that disappeared in 2014 to demonstrate the falsehood of the official account of those kidnappings. so as to force the restart of the official investigation. In fact, I believe that during the months of the exhibition of forensic architecture in MUAC in 2017, we effectively turned the museum into something of a public forum that is missing in the Republic, a space of free examination of evidence and informed judgment on public matters that certainly cannot be the goal of the Contemporary Art Museum. It cannot be the basis of its operation, but certainly is one of the possibilities of the associations and links it can produce. So despite the reputation of the academia as a territory defined by clumsiness and distance, it's clear to me that the advantage of university museums lie in the way they can articulate different networks and social initiatives. In that respect, we should be platforms to turn the claims of contemporary practices into effective dialogue by linking different disciplines and heterogeneous agents that the hybrid nature of contemporary art seems always to be calling for. So, such potential hinges in our willingness to explore the intersection we occupy, so as to knit the complex fabric of thoughts, sensations, and actions by which, without really knowing the way, we keep on building another world. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I, of course, apologize that my English is far from perfect, but it's not my original colonial language. It's my second colonial language.
Thank you, everyone, again for joining us on a Monday night. And yeah, for forcing us to change venues. We got a very enthusiastic response, or so we thought, and I didn't get to have the intimate conversation I hope we would have in the gallery, but this is good too. Thank you, Cuauhtémoc, for a very interesting presentation and what I think provides a lot of, I don't know, fertile history and areas to think about our own situation here. Just a bit of background, the reason also why I want to invite Cuauhtémoc to our school and to the gallery was because I'm also sort of in the middle of my own research and thinking about NYU Shanghai's own university art gallery, not quite a museum yet, but we can talk about what qualifies a museum as well. Why don't we just start, maybe with what you're known here for, which is right now being the artistic of the Shanghai Biennale, which just closed yesterday. Congratulations, by the way. Maybe we can start by distinguishing, again, I really want to hone in on the distinction of the academic art museum or the university institution or the university museum. Tell me, in your experience, having curated and organized this enormous global contemporary art festival in Shanghai, and how that compares, let's say, to acting as a chief curator for, a long range of programming for an art institution that is specifically embedded within a public university.
I guess that one, and I was just telling that to a colleague sitting in the building, there is something, you may probably say, extremely immediately pleasurable about doing a biennial. That has to do with the fact that the scale is devoid of the need of overcoming the daily life of complexity of a program, and trying to make something that is extremely, I know it involves a little bit of a moment of arrogance, but that's the truth, that the effort that is involved in making a biennial provides you with a significant chance to just do in one gesture what you normally need to do in a couple of years of small negotiations. There's suddenly a whole platform that is just, I mean, like a big drawing board that wants to be filled with a certain idea. And even the fact that the speed of the production is incredibly huge, it has a very few internal resistance. So it really is an incredible privilege, because you are basically under something that feels extremely frightening, a deadline, but the rest is just like kicking balls. So there's something very. I mean, of course, that's not what the people ought to see. They need to see a result. But certainly, when you are in an institution, this social contract has a number of partners. You are also trying to keep that structure developing. You are responsible so as to further those conditions. There is naturally and rightly a complex political structure that you need to operate with. University museums, if they happen to incorporate the museum logic of decision making, like mine, yeah, they are very difficult to operate by people who are not used to university decisions, because classically scholars need to antagonize in the process of those committees. Is something that is very it's something that is very useful if you know how to use it.
Can we talk about a little bit about this antagonism, though, that you I thought it was particularly interesting the way you pointed out this very purposeful positioning of an exhibition like Anish Kapoor. For those who are less familiar, he's sort of a very famous artist that works on grand scales. I think most recently known for this controversy trying to patent the color black, the darkest, and extremely commercially successful and whatnot. And then on the other hand, I don't know if they were directly opposite from each other spatially in the museum, but then, you know, there's a solo presentation of Andrea Fraser, who has a long history of institutional critique and tying money and power to the practice and workings of contemporary art. I mean, are you able to create those situations? I mean, I don't know if this is so distinctive, let's say, to a situation of a university art or an academic art museum, or why this also just couldn't take place in, say, a mainstream civic institution, or a, you know, you created, I think, those little moments as well in the works that you sort of organized and curated in the Biennale. So I just want to really, you know, get to the nature of an academic institution, and maybe you could also in that address how the funding, let's say, of a museum, and go back to I think what you've spelled out was a very interesting origin story in 2008 or the early 2000s as to how MUAC was rationalized and conceived and built. I mean, I assume Mexico City it's a huge megalopolis, as you said in your summary. I'm sure there are many
comparable to Shanghai. It's 23 million people.
Right, very comparable. So you have another very stratified and saturated art ecology. So in that sense, what distinction, and I actually even printed out the mission statements of UNAM and MUAC as well. I mean, what distinctions do you feel you're making with an institution like MUAC and tied to this enormous national university?
I guess that it is not wrong to say that there is a clear difficulty, and normally there is a lack of need of combining two very different games in the contemporary art world. The game of indulging to general audiences and collectors' tastes. They seem to coincide a lot of times. So then you go to put yourselves in the bond, and you see this kind of weird accordion, and it has a Kusama exhibition. Then you have clearly located a syndrome of a type of institution.
Yeah.
That institution is just geared towards getting artists that are safe. It's going to operate in terms of how long the queue outside is going to be, and it will represent an aspirational logic of having a mass spectacle. And then you would have an ethos of very pointed, intellectual, and to a certain point elitist criticality that will appear in public institutions. It is a matter of record that is not to be erased, that Andrea Fraser, who's, I guess, would be very easy to agree, one of the most important living artists born in the USA, has never had a retrospective in America.
Yeah, I know.
She had a retrospective organized by the Generali Foundation, which was a foundation that was funded by an insurance company. And then she had an overview organized by MACBA Proa that went in these 3 Spanish-speaking countries. So it is frequently the case that the more the insiders of the Mexican contemporary art world and the most political are dismayed by the fact that we will have a Ai Weiwei exhibition in a month. And similarly, some of the patrons don't understand why the hell we are making an exhibition about aesthetic interventions in demonstrations and protests in Mexico in the last 10 years. So I don't mean that, because I guess that I hope that what I was saying has a certain anti-determinist tone. Mm-hmm. I'm saying there's a field of possibility for that maybe a contemporary art museum coming from the university may be able to fulfill. But it is very hard to imagine doing that. Let's jump quickly in MoCA in Los Angeles, yeah. That clearly has been unable to fulfill those different roles at the same time. Yeah. So I'm trying to somehow say that there's a peculiarity in that institution, that it took the place of being the agency of developing this new power structure, the Metropolitan Museum of Contemporary Art. So it is drawn to actually look into the major audiences that, because of that development, now are going to be possible audiences of contemporary art, at the same time that needs to cater to a radical intellectual tradition, and which makes that possible. It would be possible to run it in a different way, maybe not that effectively, but those are choices that we make within those spaces.
I guess maybe I'm trying to locate in this, not to say that you don't have autonomy, but we all have our masters. And whether, I'm looking for an alignment of your mission to funding structures or governance structures, how UNAM was founded, or its relationship to, MUAC's relationship to its parent institution. Let's see, maybe you could speak to what gives you this kind of autonomy to allow people to, or your publics to both hate and love at the same time the programming, to have these kinds of critical exhibitions, blockbuster exhibitions, all at the same time? Or is this a strategy, perhaps, to
it's a strategy
attend
that
to
works,
those different
that is
conflicts?
possible to allocate, and is functional. That's the difference. Now, I would argue that, in general, the tradition of universities, as it was born in Europe, was that of corporations that were precisely outside of the direct rulers' reach, by having a structure of a certain economic and political independence. They are early bourgeois organizations, but they are also corporations. So some of those classical forms are still able to represent a certain autonomy. It's only because of the way the Mexican state had to regulate that to prevent the universities from becoming just ministerial. That explains why in Latin America they had to be constitutionally described as autonomous. But effectively, La Sorbonne is autonomous without having that name in it. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no political structures. It means that there's a complex political structure above. In this particular case, National University of Mexico is dependent on the national budget. Why is it dependent on the national budget? Because, as I guess I said, maybe that was not clear enough, there's, in the design of the Mexican state, as in other places in the world, there's the promise, assumption, and commitment that education has to be free. So therefore, the national budget may not grant people access to completely well-developed national health service, but it will find social unrest if it would not provide free education in different levels. Now, but besides that, the university is very used to be the recipient of private money, partly because, and this is something that is not necessarily the case in other places, the National University is also the coalition of huge professional bodies. So in different ways, for instance, in the most developed ways, the establishment of physicians in the country is somehow also related to the politics of the medicine faculty. Or the establishment of civil engineers has had a lot of money involved in the engineering faculty and institute. Of course, having the establishment of philosophy doesn't help you out a lot, but certainly the museum was built with a mixture of public and private funds, and still today, and that was the advantage of tapping into the absent space of contemporary art in that moment, is able to fundraise significantly. So at least 2/3 of the budget of programs are fundraised. Now, this is something that, as a matter of fact, produces something that is also valid in other museum institutions that I know, where you, by having budgets coming from different sources, you can play out your different masters.
Yeah. Do you have a separate endowment also for the museum?
No.
Any kind of investment
No. That is an institution that is not operative in Mexico as often, partly because, and that's one of the worst difficulties of the country, the tax system is not necessarily effective in certain areas. For instance, in Mexico, inheritance is tax-free. And that poses a serious hindrance to the way in which other countries manage to both accumulate historical art or to precisely produce endowments.
Yeah.
But my claim is somehow that, yeah, had it been the case that the first runner of establishing a contemporary art museum in Mexico would have been a private institution, like now the UMIX collection that has its own museum, the social structure gravitating around contemporary art would be different.
Very, and that Humex was as recent. Wasn't it open to the public around the same time?
No, they opened the museum, if I'm not wrong, in 2014. They had their collection showrooms, and previously they were funding many other initiatives. One problem of them establishing their own museum is that the money that is given to other organizations has dried.
I hate to cut this short, but I'm gonna just give a chance for our lovely patient audience here to ask a few questions, and then we should probably move on. Does anyone want to ask a question? Oh, okay. Down in front, Iris. Oh, just a second. We're recording.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, about moi, it seems to me that, well, it's a very unique university, which also has a history of leftism and of activism. I mean, it's what one expects in a way. You're also giving us something in this extraordinary program, something that this university stands for. I mean, from the decoration, from the murals, the Rivera and the Orozco and the Siqueiros. And so I was wondering, because you were talking about MACBA. So MACBA, for instance, is often doing things like this. And yet maybe I'm wrong, but in Spain or in France or in Italy, all these big countries with big public universities, where also the money, the structure is not so dissimilar, I can't think of any university museums that they don't do any of this. I mean, there was, yes, an exhibition done for 1968 last summer at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and it was unique. It was the first time they had a big public. But yeah, so it's interesting that you're still so unique and you're collaborating with things that are not necessarily university museums.
Thank you. Both are very interesting questions. If we were to analyze MACBA, and I'm happily member of the board in Barcelona, it would be very interesting to see that there's also a clash of different patrons. On the one hand, there is a group of Catalanian bourgeois people, and they actually are called the bourgeoisie, because they are not old bourgeoisie, that own the collection. And somehow, frequently they overstep the road to actually think that they own the museum. The monies of the museum are divided. They come from the regional, the national, and the city level. At this moment in time, that actually means that they actually need to respond to completely enemy parties. One of them trying to split from Spain. And on top of that, in Catalonia, there is a significant tension between the resistance of the local population that is even involved in the new city government, and the way the city has been taken by tourism and gentrification. And then, in relation to those issues, there are conflicts about how people look at MACBA, because even though it has a tradition of being very important in developing contemporary art critical reflection, is also seen as culprit of the gentrification of a significant part of downtown Barcelona. So my colleagues there and the team of Ferran Barenblit are constantly trying to play these forces one against the other. At the moment, they have a huge conflict because there is a space that they have been allocated to expand the collection that is being claimed for a hospital. So, I mean, the political tensions there are very, very interesting. And there are even a couple of artworks about magma that are really worth seeing. I mean, videos making these diagram of forces. Now, second question is something that you're clearly noticing something that I will put in these terms. It's true. I wouldn't claim the National University is leftist, all of it. It actually has different sectors. It's true, however, that the Mexican 68 was about a democracy, left-wing rebellion staged by the university, but that is also something that happened in other places. Now, what is really characteristic and special and even weird is that because of very specific historical reasons, the Mexican university is such a big concentrated institution, and also that one of its main tasks is that of cultural production. So the university has 2 symphonic orchestras, like 3 theater companies. It is actually very, very strange. So it's a secondary minister of culture, but that is something that has been even increased by this turn. Yeah.
I'm just going to read to you, actually printed out the mission statement for both UNAM and MUAC, as well as NYU Shanghai, if anyone's interested. Because I thought this was incredible that it's written into the mission. So on the very first, the overview of the university, the National Autonomous University of Mexico takes as a mission to teach higher education courses to educate professionals, researchers, university professors, and technicians who will provide a useful service to society, to organize and to carry out research primarily on the national conditions and problems, and to extend with generosity the benefits of culture to all sectors of the population. Its substantive functions are teaching, research, and the dissemination of culture. So in place of where I think a lot of universities would say the 3 branches are teaching, research, and public service in this sort of very generalized way. I thought it was very interesting that UNAM specifically phrases this third thing, this third function as the dissemination of culture, which is kind of incredible.
Structurally, there are 3 coordinations under the Vice Chancellor, which is sciences, humanities, and cultural dissemination.
Okay.
So the ministry,
So like
let's say they are those, and the budgets are not comparable, but it is specific. Yes, I know. That's something that I don't assume is universal. However, I would say that our role is to explore the specific possibilities of specific structures, and yeah, that's one there.
We actually have to close out. There's another class coming in here. I hate to, but we are going to have a small reception up in the 3rd floor lounge. There's some food and wine and drink, and anyone is welcome to chat with Cuauhtémoc with us
thank you very much.
at least another 15, 20 minutes upstairs. Thank you so much for joining us here. We know you always have a very busy schedule.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you to the visual arts area, to arts and sciences, and all of you so much for coming on a Monday night. And please grab a program for the Gallery Spring 2019 project as you leave. Thank you.